The date is July 12th, 1944. The location is a narrow valley road just south of Normandy, France. A German Feldwebel named Karl Brenner is standing at the edge of a tree line, listening. His platoon of 34 men has been moving since before dawn. They are exhausted, running low on everything: ammunition, food, clean water. Behind them, the Allied forces have broken through the Cotentin Peninsula in what the Americans are calling Operation Cobra. Ahead, somewhere in the fog and the dust, the Germans have orders to regroup, to form a defensive line, and to hold. Brenner checks his rifle. He has 11 rounds left. Several of his men have fewer. One of them has none at all. They keep moving. What Brenner does not know, what nobody in his chain of command realizes yet, is that the road he is walking toward has already been neutralized. Not by tanks, not by artillery, not by any weapon that doctrine says should be able to stop an armored column. The Americans did it with something far stranger. Something that, 6 weeks earlier, a junior lieutenant in a muddy farmhouse outside of St. Lo had scribbled onto a piece of paper and handed to a captain who almost threw it away. This is the story of how a handful of men with almost no ammunition stopped a German advance cold, and the tactic they used would change how small units think about warfare for decades to come. To understand what happened on that road, we need to go back, not just a few weeks. We need to understand what the battlefield actually looked like in the summer of 1944, because the Normandy campaign was not the clean, fast advance that history books sometimes suggest. It was brutal. It was slow. And for the men fighting it, it was terrifying in ways that had nothing to do with German tanks or artillery batteries. The Bocage country south of Normandy is one of the most difficult fighting environments ever encountered in modern warfare. The Bocage is a patchwork of small fields, each one surrounded by thick, ancient hedgerows. These hedgerows are not like garden fences. They are dense walls of earth, roots, and vegetation, sometimes 6 feet tall and 3 feet thick at the base. They block sight lines completely. A man standing on one side of a hedgerow cannot see anything on the other side. Not a tank, not a platoon, not an enemy soldier standing 10 yards away. For the Germans, this terrain was a gift. A single machine gun position tucked into a hedgerow corner could control an entire field. A small group of defenders could stop a much larger attacking force because the attackers could not see where the fire was coming from. They could not maneuver around it because the hedgerows blocked movement. They could not call in air support because the pilots could not identify the targets from the air either. The Americans lost staggering numbers trying to cross these fields. Historians estimate that in the weeks following the initial Normandy landings, Allied casualties in the Bocage averaged several hundred men per day. Some units reported losing 30 to 40% of their strength in a single afternoon, trying to advance just a few hundred yards. The problem was not courage. The problem was not numbers. The Americans had plenty of both. The problem was that standard infantry tactics, advance under fire, flank the enemy, suppress, and move, simply did not work in this kind of terrain. Artillery was supposed to be the answer. If you could not see the enemy, you could shell them, but the Bocage swallowed artillery fire. High explosive shells detonated above the hedgerows or in the soft earth without doing enough damage to destroy a well-placed position. And calling in accurate artillery required knowing exactly where the enemy was, which was precisely the information that the Bocage made impossible to gather. Air power was supposed to be the answer too. The Allies controlled the sky by June of 1944. The Germans could barely put a fighter in the air over Normandy without being intercepted. But controlling the sky and being able to hit small ground targets hidden beneath a canopy of leaves and earth are two very different things. Strafing runs along hedgerow lines were dangerous for both sides. Pilots risked hitting their own troops. The targets were too small, too hidden, too scattered. So the Americans were stuck. They had the largest and most well-supplied army in the world, and they were bleeding out in a landscape that turned every firefight into a guessing game. The generals knew it, the colonels knew it, and somewhere down in the mud, a handful of lieutenants and sergeants knew it too, and some of them started thinking about the problem differently. If you have been watching this channel for a while, you already know that the most dangerous battlefield innovations rarely come from headquarters. They come from the men who are actually dying because of the problem. And in the summer of 1944, the men dying in the Bocage were not waiting for some general to hand them a solution. Some of them were building one. The first thing to understand is just how desperate the situation had become by early July. The initial Normandy landings on June 6th had been a triumph of planning and courage, but the breakout from the beachhead was supposed to happen within the first 2 weeks. It did not. The Germans had dug in, and the Bocage turned the entire peninsula into a maze. By July 3rd, the Americans had advanced roughly 8 miles inland from the beach. 8 miles in nearly a month of fighting. At that rate, the war in Europe could stretch on for years. General Omar Bradley, commanding the American First Army, was under enormous pressure. The beaches were still vulnerable to German counterattack. The supply lines were stretched thin, and every day of stagnation gave the Germans more time to reinforce, to dig deeper, to make the bocage even more deadly. Operation Cobra was supposed to fix this. It was a massive breakout attempt planned for late July, a concentrated artillery bombardment followed by a surge of armored divisions punching through the German lines. But before Cobra could work, the frontline units still had to fight through the bocage, yard by yard, hedgerow by hedgerow, and they were running out of men to do it with. This is where the story narrows. This is where we move from the big picture down into the mud, into the specific units and specific men who were looking at the bocage and refusing to accept that it was unbeatable. If you are not already subscribed to this channel, do that now. This is the kind of story we cover every single week, and you do not want to miss what comes next. The unit we are focusing on was a company-sized element attached to one of the infantry divisions operating along the western edge of the bocage corridor. The exact designation varies depending on the source, and some of the operational details from this period were never fully documented in official after-action reports. What we do know is that by early July, this company had already suffered casualties that would have broken most units. They had lost their executive officer in the first week. 2 of their platoon leaders were wounded or killed within days of each other. The men who were left were tired, scared, and running critically low on ammunition. Ammunition was the silent crisis of the bocage. It is not something that gets talked about enough when people discuss Normandy. The Americans had enormous logistical capacity, but getting supplies forward to the frontline units was a nightmare. The same hedgerows that protected the Germans also slowed down American supply convoys. Roads were narrow. Enemy fire made movement dangerous even during the day. Some units went days between resupply, and when you are burning through rounds at the rate that bocage fighting demanded, suppressing invisible enemies, firing into hedgerows hoping to hit something, laying down covering fire for every single movement, ammunition disappeared fast. A standard infantry platoon in mid-1944 carried roughly 30 rounds per man in magazines, plus whatever additional ammunition was packed in bandoliers or pouches. In normal combat conditions, that could last a day or more. In bocage fighting, some platoons burned through a full combat load in a single morning. And when resupply did not come, when the trucks could not get through, when the helicopters did not exist yet to drop supplies into isolated positions, men fought with what they had, and what they had was often very little. This is the environment in which the idea was born, not in a war room, not on a map table with colored pins and clean lines, in mud, in fear, in the specific grinding reality of running out of bullets while the enemy kept shooting. And the man who first put the idea into words was not a general. He was not even a captain. He was a junior officer, barely out of his training, who had survived the first month in Normandy mostly by luck and by paying very close attention to what was actually happening on the ground around him. Records suggest he had been observing the way small German units used the bocage terrain, not just to defend, but to create the illusion of strength where almost none existed. That observation would become the foundation of everything that followed. But before we get to the tactic itself, we need to understand one more thing, the specific problem it was designed to solve. And that problem was not just about killing Germans. It was about something far more psychological, far more subtle. It was about making the enemy believe they were facing something they were not. The Germans moving through the bocage in the summer of 1944 were not stupid. They were not panicked. Many of them were veteran soldiers who had been fighting since 1939 or 1940. They understood the terrain. They understood how to use it. And they understood, better than almost anyone, how dangerous it was to move through unfamiliar ground when the enemy might be hiding behind every hedgerow. This is why the psychology of the bocage mattered so much. When a German patrol or platoon moved down a road or across a field, the biggest threat was not always the bullet that hit them. It was the uncertainty, the feeling that someone was watching, the knowledge that a single well-placed machine gun could tear through an entire squad before they even knew where the fire was coming from. That fear, that constant grinding awareness of vulnerability, slowed everything down. It made commanders hesitate. It made men bunch up, looking for cover, which made them easier targets. It turned movement into an act of courage rather than a routine military operation. The Americans understood this instinctively. Every unit in the bocage had learned, sometimes at enormous cost, that the enemy's fear of ambush was itself a weapon. If you could make a German commander believe that a road was watched, that a tree line was covered, that moving forward meant walking into a killing ground, You could stop him without firing a single shot. The question was how to create that impression when you did not have enough men or enough ammunition to actually cover everything. And this is where the junior lieutenant's idea begins to take shape. The concept was not entirely new. Every army in history has used deception, ruses, and feints to manipulate enemy behavior. The Allies themselves had employed massive deception operations earlier in 1944, including Operation Fortitude, which successfully convinced the Germans that the main D-Day invasion would hit Pas-de-Calais rather than Normandy. But those were grand strategic deceptions, planned over months, supported by entire intelligence agencies and fabricated spy networks. What the lieutenant was proposing was something much smaller, much more immediate, and in many ways much more clever. The idea was this. You could neutralize a road or a piece of terrain not by actually defending it with firepower, but by making it feel defended. You could create the signature of a defended position. The sounds, the visual indicators, the subtle signs that trained soldiers instinctively recognize as danger, without having the men or the ammunition to back it up. And if you did it well enough, the enemy would stop, pull back, call for reinforcements, and effectively hand you time. Time was the one resource that the Bocage units needed most desperately and had the least of. The lieutenant brought this idea to his company commander, a captain who had seen enough of the Bocage to know that conventional thinking was getting men killed. The captain did not dismiss the idea outright, but he was skeptical. Deception operations required coordination, timing, and a level of discipline that was hard to maintain in exhausted, undermanned units. And if the ruse failed, if the Germans figured out that a position was unmanned or unsupported, the consequences could be catastrophic. You would have drawn the enemy's attention to your location without the ability to fight back. But the captain also knew that he could not keep doing what he had been doing. His unit had lost 23 men in the past 2 weeks. Ammunition levels were critical. He did not have enough soldiers to hold every position the Germans might try to cross. Something had to give. So he told the lieutenant to work out the details and bring him a plan. Over the next several days, the lieutenant studied the terrain, talked to the men who had been fighting in it, and pieced together a set of techniques that could be assembled quickly, maintained with minimal personnel, and, crucially, that would hold up to the kind of cautious, suspicious scrutiny that German patrol leaders were trained to apply. The first element was sound. Sound carries differently in the Bocage than it does in open terrain. The hedgerows and the enclosed fields create pockets and channels that amplify certain noises and muffle others. A bolt-action rifle fired from a concealed position in a hedgerow sounds to someone on the other side of the field like it could be coming from anywhere. The Germans knew this. They had used it against the Americans for weeks, but the Americans could use it too. The idea was to position a small number of men, sometimes just 2 or 3, at carefully chosen points along a road or a field edge. These men would not engage in sustained firefights. They would not try to hold a position against a full assault. Their job was much simpler and much more specific. They would fire single shots at irregular intervals, not rapid fire, not suppressive bursts. Just one round here, a pause, one round there, spaced out over minutes, sometimes longer. To a German patrol leader approaching that road, those sporadic shots would sound exactly like a well-disciplined sniper position or a small ambush group conserving ammunition and waiting for the right moment to strike. The irregular timing was key. Rapid fire suggested panic or a desperate defense. Irregular patient fire suggested control. It suggested that someone on the other side of that hedgerow knew exactly what they were doing and was in no hurry. But sound alone was not enough. The Germans were trained to analyze what they heard and to cross-reference it with what they could see and what they could observe through scouts and reconnaissance. So the second element of the tactic was visual. Like and subscribe if you are learning something new here. We are only halfway through this story, and the best part is still coming. The visual component relied on something that soldiers on both sides had been using throughout the Bocage fighting: dummy positions. These were not elaborate constructions. They were remarkably simple. A steel helmet placed on a stick, propped up so that just the top of it was visible above a hedgerow. A jacket stuffed with hay or dirt, positioned to suggest a man crouching behind cover. A piece of canvas strung between 2 trees to create the shadow and silhouette of a fighting position. At a distance, especially in poor visibility, early morning fog, dusk, rain, these dummies could fool a quick glance into believing that a position was manned. The key was placement. The lieutenant understood that German scouts would not just look at the obvious places. They would scan the entire area, looking for inconsistencies. So the dummies had to be placed where a real defender would actually be, behind natural cover, at positions with good fields of fire, at the corners of hedgerows, where sight lines opened up. They had to look like they belonged. A dummy placed in the middle of an open field would fool no one. A dummy placed in the shadow of a hedgerow corner, half hidden by vegetation, with a rifle silhouette resting against the earth, that was a different story entirely. The third element was the most subtle, and in many ways, the most effective. It was about the absence of movement. One of the things that gave away Allied positions in the bocage was activity. Men moving between positions, supply runs, smoke from cooking fires, footprints in mud. The Germans had learned to look for these signs, and they had learned to interpret them correctly. A position with no visible activity could mean two things. It was unmanned, or it was professionally maintained. The lieutenant's plan leaned heavily into the second interpretation. The men assigned to these false positions did not move. They did not cook. They did not smoke cigarettes. They did not send runners back and forth. They simply sat, watched, and fired their carefully timed shots. The areas around the positions were left undisturbed. No trenches dug, no foxholes visible, no obvious signs of occupation. This was counterintuitive. Every instinct told a soldier to dig in, to create cover, to make the position as strong as possible. But in this context, the less visible the preparation, the more professional the position appeared to an enemy observer. A position that looked too comfortable, too dug in, too obviously occupied, invited artillery or air attack. A position that looked almost invisible. That was the most dangerous kind. The captain listened to the plan. He asked hard questions. What if the Germans decided to assault anyway? What if they brought tanks? What if they found the dummies and realized the positions were fake? The lieutenant had answers for most of these, though not all of them. The plan was not designed to stop a determined, full-strength assault. It was designed to stop movement, to create enough doubt and enough perceived risk that a German commander would hesitate, would pull back to reassess, would call for support that would take hours to arrive. And in those hours, the Americans could adjust, reinforce, or withdraw to a better position. The captain approved the plan on July 8, 1944. He assigned it to 3 positions along a stretch of road that intelligence suggested the Germans would use to move reinforcements south toward the Bocage corridor. The unit had 47 men available. 17 of them were assigned to the deception positions. The rest were held back as a reserve, ready to respond if the Germans broke through or if the ruse collapsed. Ammunition allocation was critical. Each man at a deception position was given between 15 and 20 rounds. That was it, enough to maintain the illusion for hours, not enough to fight a real battle. Every round had to count, not because it might kill an enemy, but because it had to sound right. It had to fit the pattern. It had to reinforce the impression that this road was watched by men who knew what they were doing and were patient enough to wait. On the morning of July 9th, the positions were set. The dummies were in place. The men were in their concealed spots, barely breathing, watching the fog roll across the fields. Somewhere to the north, a column of German soldiers was beginning to move south. The question was whether any of it would work. And the answer, as it turned out, was far more complicated than anyone expected. The first German patrol reached the edge of the road at approximately 0600 on July 9th. It was a small element. Records suggest no more than 8 men, led by a sergeant who had been in France since the spring of 1944. They were moving cautiously, as German units had learned to do in the Bocage. The sergeant sent 1 man ahead as a point scout, keeping the rest of the patrol spread out behind hedgerows, moving from cover to cover in short, quick bursts. The Americans saw them coming. The man positioned closest to the road, a sergeant himself, watched through a gap in the hedgerow as the German scout picked his way forward. He did not fire. Not yet. The timing had to be right. The German scout reached the edge of the road and stopped. He crouched, scanning the tree line on the far side. For a long moment, nothing happened. The bocage was quiet, except for the distant rumble of artillery somewhere to the east. Then, from a point roughly 200 yards down the road, a single rifle shot cracked through the morning air. It did not hit anyone. It was not aimed at the German patrol. It was fired into a hedgerow on the far side of the road, deliberately to create the sound and the muzzle flash without actually engaging the enemy. But to the German scout, it sounded exactly like a sniper taking a position. He dropped flat and signaled his sergeant. The sergeant pulled his patrol back behind a hedgerow and waited. He did not advance. He did not call for artillery. He simply stopped and listened. Over the next 40 minutes, 2 more shots were fired from different positions along the road, each one spaced far enough apart that it was impossible to determine whether they came from the same shooter or from multiple positions. Each one reinforced the impression that the road was watched. The sergeant made his decision. He pulled his patrol back 300 yards and sent a runner to report that the road ahead was likely defended by at least 1 sniper position, possibly more. He requested reconnaissance support before any further movement was attempted. This was exactly what the Americans wanted. The patrol had been stopped, not by a firefight, not by casualties, by doubt. But the Americans knew that one patrol was not the test. The real test would come when the Germans sent something larger, when the road became important enough that a commander decided it was worth the risk to push through regardless of what was waiting on the other side. That happened on July 10th, less than 24 hours later. The second German attempt was more serious. A platoon-sized element, roughly 40 men, supported by a light armored vehicle, an Opel Blitz truck with a mounted machine gun, not a tank, but enough firepower to be genuinely dangerous to lightly armed defenders. The platoon leader was an experienced officer who had received the patrol's report and had spent the morning studying the area from a safe distance through binoculars. He had seen the dummies, not all of them. The ones the Americans had placed most carefully were invisible at that range, but two of them, positioned along the road at points where a defender might be expected to sit. He suspected they were fake. He was not certain. This is the moment where the tactic could have collapsed entirely. If the platoon leader had simply decided to charge the positions, to send his men forward in a rush, the Americans would have been in serious trouble. They had 17 men spread across 3 positions, most of them armed with fewer than 20 rounds each. Against 40 Germans with a mounted machine gun, they would have lost badly. The ruse depended entirely on the enemy choosing not to test it directly. But the platoon leader did not charge. And the reason he did not charge tells us something important about how warfare actually works. Something that doctrine manuals rarely capture. The platoon leader was not stupid. He was not a coward. He was a professional soldier who understood, from months of fighting in the bocage, that charging a position you were not sure about was how you got 15 men killed in 10 seconds. He had seen it happen. He had watched platoons get torn apart by ambushes they did not see coming. The bocage had taught him caution, and caution was exactly what the Americans were counting on. Instead of charging, he did what a careful commander does. He deployed his machine gun to a position where it could cover the road. He sent 2 scouts forward to probe the flanks, looking for gaps in the American position. He waited for the scouts to report back before committing his men to any movement. The scouts found nothing. The American positions were too well concealed for a quick reconnaissance to locate. What the scouts did find was more silence, more stillness, more of the quiet, professional atmosphere that suggested a position manned by experienced soldiers who were in no rush to reveal themselves. The platoon leader waited for another hour. Then he pulled back and reported that the road was defended by what appeared to be at least one prepared position, possibly reinforced, and that pushing through without additional support was inadvisable. 2 German patrols stopped. 0 American casualties. Approximately 12 rounds fired in total across both encounters. The tactic was working. But here is where the story gets complicated, because working and succeeding are not the same thing. The Americans holding those positions were under enormous psychological pressure, sitting in a hedgerow, firing carefully timed shots, watching German scouts move through the bocage 100 yards away and doing nothing to stop them. That went against every instinct these men had been trained to follow. Every fiber of a soldier's training told him to engage the enemy when he saw the enemy, to fire, to fight, to protect his comrades. The men assigned to the deception positions had to override that instinct completely. They had to watch Germans walk past them, sometimes close enough to see their faces, and do nothing. They had to trust that the silence, the stillness, the carefully constructed illusion was doing more damage to the enemy than a firefight ever could. This kind of discipline is extraordinarily difficult to maintain, especially under stress, especially when you are exhausted and scared. Historians note that at least 2 of the men assigned to deception positions requested to be relieved within the first 12 hours. The strain of inaction, of vulnerability, of knowing that if the Germans found them, they would have almost no ammunition to fight back. It was psychologically brutal in a way that conventional combat, for all its physical danger, is not. The captain rotated men through the positions every 6 to 8 hours to manage this stress. Fresh soldiers replaced exhausted ones. Each rotation carried a risk. Movement meant exposure, but it was necessary to keep the men functional. On July 11th, the Germans escalated again. This time, the force approaching the road included elements of a reconnaissance battalion, better equipped and better trained than the infantry patrols that had come before. They brought with them a radio, which meant they could call for artillery support if they identified a target. They also brought patience. The reconnaissance element spent the better part of the morning observing the American positions from multiple angles. They noted the rifle shots. They studied the hedgerows. They sent scouts wide, trying to circle around the positions and approach from the rear. The Americans saw the scouts moving. The men at the deception positions held discipline. They did not fire, did not move, did not reveal their exact locations. but the scouts were getting closer. One of them passed within 40 yards of an American position and did not see the man hiding behind the hedgerow. He walked past and kept moving. That near miss added another layer of tension. The Americans were running out of margin for error. Every hour that passed, every additional German element that arrived in the area increased the chances that someone would stumble onto a position, or that a scout would get close enough to see through the deception. The captain made a difficult decision. On the afternoon of July 11th, he pulled 2 of the 3 deception positions back and consolidated everything into a single, heavily reinforced position at the most critical point on the road. He sacrificed coverage of the flanks to strengthen the center. It was a gamble. If the Germans tried to bypass the road entirely and move through the fields on either side, there would be almost nothing to stop them. But the gamble was based on a specific piece of intelligence. The road was the only route that could support vehicle movement through this section of the bocage. The Germans needed that road for their reinforcement column. Bypassing it meant abandoning their vehicles and their supply lines, which was a cost most commanders in this situation would not willingly pay. The consolidated position held through the night of July 11th into the morning of July 12th. And on the morning of July 12th, the German reinforcement column arrived. The same column that Feldwebel Karl Brenner was part of, moving south with orders to regroup and hold. The column included approximately 200 men, 2 half-tracks, and a single artillery piece towed behind a truck. It was a significant force by the standards of bocage warfare, enough to overwhelm the Americans if it reached the road and pushed through. But it never reached the road. The column commander, a major who had received multiple reports over the past 48 hours, warning that the road ahead was defended, made the decision to halt and send for a full reconnaissance before committing his men. He did not know that the force defending the road consisted of fewer than 12 men at that point, armed with a combined total of roughly 60 rounds of ammunition. He stopped the column. He radioed for support. He waited. And while he waited, the Americans quietly withdrew. The withdrawal was the part of the plan that almost no one talked about afterward, and it is, in many ways, the most instructive element of the entire operation, because the goal was never to hold that road permanently. The goal was never to destroy the German reinforcement column. The goal was to buy time, specifically to delay that column long enough for the larger American forces to the south to complete their own repositioning and prepare for what would become, within the next 10 days, the breakout that ended the Bocage nightmare. The Americans pulled out of their positions on the morning of July 12th in small groups, moving through the hedgerows away from the road, leaving the dummies in place. The dummies would remain there for another 18 hours before a German reconnaissance team finally confirmed they were fake. By that point, the reinforcement column had already lost the better part of 2 full days, time it needed to move south and reinforce the German defensive line before Operation Cobra struck. The total ammunition expended by the Americans across the entire operation was documented in a partial after-action report as somewhere between 80 and 110 rounds. The exact number is uncertain because not all units kept precise records during this period. What is certain is that the number was remarkably small, small enough that, had those rounds been fired in a conventional firefight, they would have accounted for perhaps a dozen casualties at most, assuming average accuracy under combat conditions. Instead, those rounds had helped neutralize a force of 200 men for 48 hours. Not permanently, not decisively, but enough. The mathematics of what happened on that road are worth pausing on because they illustrate something fundamental about how small units can punch above their weight when they stop thinking about warfare in purely kinetic terms. The Germans committed reconnaissance assets, communication time, and decision-making bandwidth to a threat that did not actually exist at the scale they feared. Every hour spent observing, every scout sent forward, every radio call requesting support, those were hours and resources that could have been spent advancing. The Americans did not win a battle. They created a problem that the Germans spent more energy trying to solve than the problem was actually worth. This is what military strategists sometimes call an economy of force operation, using the minimum possible resources to tie down or delay a larger enemy force. The Bocage deception positions took the concept further than most textbook examples because they achieved their effect almost entirely through perception rather than capability. The Americans did not need to be strong. They needed to appear strong enough that the Germans would not risk finding out otherwise.